for anyone who doesn't have the context, FHIR milestones are now named R1, R2, R3, R4. If you go back in the past, you'll see DSTU1, STU2, STU, and then R3. We're trying to get our naming correct, right? We know what we're doing here. STU is standard for trial use. So the way standards work is a formal standard, a full standard, is called a normative standard. And it's committed to not being no breaking changes. We can add new stuff, but if we made a mistake in the past, then we can live with it forever. But that's obviously, you need to know what you're doing before you commit to that. So HL7 releases standards for trial use. We're saying, here's a draft standard, have a go, see how it works, give us feedback and we'll fix it. Our first release, STU1, was pre-draft. It was the first stake in the ground. Said, here it is, draft standard for trial use, have a look. And then next 2 and 3, we basically iterated towards maturity on that. And so they are about 18 months apart, the milestone releases. We've done the third release, R3, and we're working on release 4. Release 4 is due out at the end of next year. It's about an 18-month cycle. We just can't get it much faster than that. It's possible when we're much more stable and we have a stable infrastructure that we'll go to do what DICOM does, which is a 10-week release cycle. Maybe, but that's for the future. So 10 or 12 weeks. So for the moment, our main focus is to release 4 at the end of next year, and that's what I'm telling you about what's in release 4. So I'm going to tell you about HL7 organisational changes. I'm going to tell you the infrastructural changes in the specification, some additional functionality we're adding, and tell you about known breaking changes. There are some, and some changes in the community. Now, we're going to keep an eye on time, but I have time for questions as I'm going through. So if you want to ask about something I've said, just raise your hand and we'll take it there. So this is HL7's published board strategy for this coming year. And you'll notice that the third item of the published board strategy is to establish FHIR as a primary standard for global health data interoperability. How many people in the room think that FHIR is already the primary standard for global health data interoperability? You're just being nice to me, thanks. We're not there yet. So why are we not there? The way I look at standards is it's a process like a river. And you start with someone creates the standard, creates a community around the standard, develops the interest, publishes the standard. Then you have implementation community, growing the implementation community, getting things implemented, getting them into production, maintenance, and finally people closing out the standard because it's too old and no one use anymore. And there might be a 30 or 40 year time frame. If you look at standards now, it's already clear that at the standards development level, FHIR is the primary standard for global healthcare data interoperability. All the other standards processes around the world that are not FHIR based are starting to tail down, while FHIR is still tailing up. But if you go and look at implementation, profiling, what people are actually working on today, getting ready, it's a much more balanced picture. There are lots of people working on FHIR, there's lots of people just going, we're doing what we're doing already. If you go and look at what data is actually exchanging, but hardly anybody's using FHIR statistically, there's a vast amount of other stuff going on, but that will change. So in a sense, you have to ask what is the goal here? So at the standards level, we're sort of 50% of the way into making FHIR the primary standard, but then it's just a matter of time as it flows out. When we look at the FHIR goal, we have these 4 activities to undertake. To increase understanding of FHIR usage and the value of usage worldwide by meetings like today. To achieve symbiotic link of brand and financial benefit between HL7 and FHIR. And clearly, that's a challenge for HL7. We open sourced FHIR, and I think that was a good, right decision. But it means that HL7 actually incurs increased costs and decreased revenue. So we, as HL7, we actually need to pay attention to that because that's our bottom line. And so that's about internal goals. I want to demonstrate the value of FHIR in enabling interoperability. And we want to ensure resources within and outside HL7 are most effectively focused to enhance FHIR. And that's an interesting thing. Now, I'm not going to talk about these anymore, but if you have any ideas about these things, come and talk to me. Because one of the things I need to do in the next 12 months is execute on this strategy. Okay, so release 4, FHIR, will be the first normative standard. So I need to be really clear about this. Parts of the standard will be normative. So if you've had much to do with FHIR, you'll know about the maturity process. The resources start as a draft and they get implemented by a few insiders, and at that point we could take the resource away. We could completely rechange its scope. We could decide we're going to do the requirements differently. Anything's possible. But then as more and more people use it and connect on it, we start having prototype implementations. It gets harder and harder to change. And it gets less and less necessary to change it. It's not a binary process, it's a gradual process. And to help people understand where we are, we track it through a maturity process towards maturity level 4 or 5, which is notionally based on this classic maturity model stuff from software development. The end of that process is normative. We go, you know what, we need to set this in stone and not change it anymore. Release 4 is the first time we're trying to do that. So we're going to pick a few different parts of the specification and ballot them as normative packages. So that once they pass normative, then there will no longer be backward breaking changes to them. We've identified 4 main areas that we're going to ballot as normative. Basically the framework of FHIR itself. What are data types, the XML JSON formats, just the way the definitions work. Then the set of conformance resources that are the core to conformance, code system, value set, concept map, structure definition, maybe capability statement, maybe a couple of others. They're still on, we haven't finalised that. Yeah.
Does that include operations?
No, some operations, but not all of them. Patient and maybe some stuff around patient. Patient's really stable now, it's a very clear candidate. And observation, and maybe some stuff around observation. So the idea is we'll give them a go. If we can't, the thing with normative ballot is if we put something up for ballot and someone says, oh, you need to change this, and we go look at it, go, actually, right, we need to change this, it resets the ballot process. We can't just change it and then publish. We have to ballot that again. And typically normative ballots can take 5 years to get through that process and keep resetting the process. More and more people get engaged, you keep resetting the process. So what we're going to do is we'll ballot it. If we get it through the process, then it becomes normative. Otherwise, we fall back to standard for trial use and try again next time. That's how the process is going to work. So we'll just keep rolling forward with the release cycles and get to normative as we can. So the rest, all the stuff that's currently draft, will stay as draft. We'll keep making changes. Now, one thing that needs to be clear is we don't yet know what breaking change exactly is. We have some definition of the rules, but and you can read those rules in the version interversion part of the specification, but there's a series of challenges there that we haven't actually experienced yet. Okay, we've introduced certification in FHIR. So as of now, you can go and enroll for FHIR Proficiency Certificate. So this is like a low level, this is our entry level test. It indicates if you pass this, you know what's in the specification, you know the overall shape of the specification and what it's doing. You don't need to know the detailed inside innards of the specification. If you've been to a connectathon and you've done the patient track, you're not quite ready because you need to just read up about the breadth of the specification. You need to know how the licensing works, you need to know how the rollout process works. If you've done all that, then you should be able to pass proficiency certificate testing. We're currently, at the moment, just prototyping that, making sure we're happy with the typical questions and the pass rates. If you're interested, I encourage you to go to HL7.org and sign up, and you can perform the testing anytime. You don't need to do it at a working group meeting. You can go sign up on the HL7 website and then go and do the test. You can either do the test at a testing centre in your local place of local city, or you can do it at home under certain or in your office under certain conditions. They video you doing it. So you can do that, and I encourage you to do that. We've had a few people pass, which was at the last week group meeting, but people kind of in the mindset of I have to be at an HL7 event to do it, but you don't. You can do it anywhere, and so I encourage you to do it. Then there's professional certification coming. There's a much harder test. Basically, proficiency certificate means, yeah, you know what the specification's about. If you pass professional certification, we know that you're able to say to your customers as a consultant or your partners as a company, we really know what we're talking about. You can rely on us to give you good advice. To pass this, you need to have demonstrated experience. You need to show that you can use the API, and then you need to pass the test, and the test is hard. The core team will fail it first time. You've got to know the breadth of the specification really well. And that's a professional certificate in that it's certified. It will be certified itself against the testing authority, the education authorities, so that when you pass this, you'll have letters you can put after your name. That's not ready yet. We're getting to that. Okay. This next change I want to talk about is Smart App Launch. We have actually balloted the Smart App Launch part of the Smart on FHIR specification and application launch protocol. It's currently undergoing reconciliation. It's not actually part of Release 4, and that you can use it against Release 2 and Release 3 and Release 4 when it comes out, but it's new change along with Release 4. I just wanted to point out that a lot of people don't realise quite how far we're going to go with the Smart on FHIR framework, and I published a write-up with Josh at this URL, which will be in the presentations you get, about how you can use this to do your own integration with your own trading partners. And I encourage you to read that. On the plan for Release 4 is much more support for interversion, crossing versions with FHIR. At the moment, up till now, we've basically put our heads in the sand and said, if you want to do FHIR, then you've got to deal with whatever issues arise with versioning, because we're not stable yet. Well, it's clear that it's going to be a long time before we're truly stable, and so we're going to be paying more attention to this. So we have a new connectathon stream in New Orleans for a API that's cross-version, and so you basically use a media type parameter FHIR version on your MIME media type. My server already supports this if you want to test it now. We don't know if this solves all the problems, because there's a few places where you don't have a media type. For instance, if you're storing FHIR resources in a file. If you're storing them in a database, we expect you to add a field for something like this, but as a file, how does that work? We have to figure that out. So you can expect more in this space. We've been working on GraphQL support. How many people know what GraphQL is? About 50%. For those of you who don't, I encourage you to learn about GraphQL. We've described how to use GraphQL with FHIR. We've shown how to you can use GraphQL to filter the elements that are returned from a resource, then to join references, so you can just walk into the resources inline in the reference and be quite clever about which resources you want to retrieve. You can also use to flatten what comes back. So instead of getting the deep resource tree, you can get down to a table of data, and it's really very powerful technique. We've been working on an R client, which is a statistical analysis and graphing language, and that's where the GraphQL stuff really comes into its own. But if you're a client, you should know what GraphQL can do, and I think we need to give that more priority. So I encourage you to read about GraphQL. We're going to expand the FHIR API to start handling larger amounts of data. At the moment, we've kind of done a lot of the semantics, and once you've actually done all the work internally to map to your semantics in your system, then someone comes and says, well, I want to do a big data extract. You're like, well, you know, I've already done a lot of mapping to FHIR. Maybe you could just get FHIR stuff, and we'll reuse our mappings and make that our core interoperability. But we don't really have APIs good for retrieving large amounts of data from systems. So some of the things we're working on for release 4 is an API for long-running requests. So you actually ask the service for something, and instead of waiting to hear back for the whole set, the server returns you immediately and says, okay, contact me here to see how it's going, and you just ping the server till it's done. We added support for a format suitable for very large amounts of data, which is new line delimited JSON, and we'll consider Parquet and Avro and some other bulk data formats if we need to. And we're working on additional semantics to request large amounts of data. So this way you could go and say, here's my patient set, just give me everything on the patient set. Maybe you get 100 gig of data back, whatever, and then that'll work. And we're doing a connectathon stream around that at New Orleans, but my servers already support this as we prototyped it, so you're welcome to give that a go. We've consulted the community about a few breaking changes. The first is to rename valueset.compose to valueset definition. This failed. The community voted this down big time, and so it's not going to happen. We had a question for the community around use of related types with observation. That's not resolved yet. We have a proposal to change from John Gruber style original Markdown to GitHub flavoured Markdown. That looks like it's going to get up, and we'll be changing across the board the Markdown flavour we use. There's a reference to the blog describing those changes. But those are the changes to mature FMM4 plus content. There's hundreds of breaking changes in the less mature content that we're not consulting about. If you want to comment on those, you just have to go and look for yourself. But if you look in the spec, a lot of people haven't found these yet, there's interversion maps between release 2 and release 3, and we'll be maintaining those for release 3 to release 4. We've added a bunch of new content to the specification, including the first 5, 6, you can see a new domain content going into the specification, case reporting, public health, occupational data, a test catalogue, better control for blood transfusion, blood bag tracking, more support for devices, more insurance plan tracking. We're working on improvements to subscription, and we are working with the European Medications Agency around medication registration process, and hopefully we'll be working with more than just the Europeans on that. I have a question mark in that because I'm not sure what the timeline of that is, whether that'll be for release 4. We're certainly going to be adding a lot more content to the specification, broadening the specification. We're still continuing to improve the quality of the definitions underneath the specification. Any of you who know what W5 is, and probably most of you haven't run into W5, we're going to be making that a formal logical model a more obvious. I'll be generating code in the reference implementations for supporting the logical models that are the sort of the abstract base for FHIR. We're continuing to do more quality and consistency work, and we're starting to leverage RDF for that. So there's an RDF stream here and an RDF Birds of the Feather session later today. Which reminds me, and we're also going to do a subscription Birds of the Feather later today, but if you're interested in subscriptions, we're going to be working on that. And we will be adding more mappings to definitional resources. I shouldn't have used the word resources there, I realise now. Other resources like biological ontologies, medical dictionaries, SNOMED CT will be beefing up the definitional I'm going to tell you a little bit of the FHIR Foundation. After this, the next talk, I'm going to talk about the FHIR Foundation in full. But the FHIR Foundation, HL7 develops the specification. We do the standards work at HL7. And what HL7 is good at publishing standards. And it's a particular, very specialist kind of skill. But FHIR community is much more now than a standards community. We don't just develop standards, throw them over the wall and go forth and have fun. We're deeply involved in that process. So we provide infrastructure to help the community. We support collaboration groups that don't need a formal standards process. We publish implementation guides that are not balloted through HL7. We can, and in one case do, act as a trusted third party for actual data on behalf of the community. None of those things HL7 is set up to do. And we run that registry.fhir.org. So all of those are run technically by the FHIR Foundation, which is an independent body of HL7 that has a board and has members, and I encourage you all to become members, and I'll be talking about this in the next session. And that supports the provision of all that framework to the community to support the implementation process. All right, so what else? These are the things that I don't know what we're doing about right now. The things that I think we should have an answer to and don't. We need to improve our support for national and domain-specific adoption programs. We have some support. It's not good enough yet. It's what we're working on now, and you'll hear some parts of that at this meeting, but we're still getting that better. If I look around the world, I see that adoption in Europe is only informal. There's not, for many, in most countries, there's not any formal support for FHIR as a standard. There's no formal relationships with SEN. That side of it's running slow. It's behind where I would like it to be. There's plenty of use, and I'm really pleased and I'm excited to see lots of people here today at the DevDays, but I'd like to get more formal support. And so that's something that HL7 is working on. And there's very little use of FHIR through Africa. And personally, I'd like to see that change. There's some, and there was some very early use in Africa, but there just isn't a lot of stuff in Africa. So that's something else I'd like to see change. And it's actually related to that. I'd like to see us get more support for aggregate data reporting. Maybe we have what we need, maybe. But it's only maybe. We haven't really seen that in production. We haven't seen that tested and connectathon, and I'd like to see that happen. So I'm talking about, say, reporting to WHO and saying this year we had X number of our population had a certain disease, X number of those had a particular treatment, these were the outcomes at an aggregate level. There's people who would like to see that in FHIR, and there's projects that are circling us, but it's not bedded down yet. I'd like us to further develop CDS hooks and round that out to be more broad service than what it currently is focusing on for Release 1. I'm not saying, for those of you who are tracking CDS hooks, that we need to get Release 1 out the door, and then we need to expand and mature CDS hooks. I need to get more investment in FHIR.org on the table, so that we have more services provided through FHIR.org to support the community. And I've got a laundry list of stuff that I want to see FHIR.org do in one server or another, but it's not doing it right now. I'd like to see us introduce a reusable formal review process for content. Those of you who've used OpenAir CKM, I'd like to see a process like that runs in the FHIR community. But what I want to see when I see that run in the FHIR community, I want to see a process that can be used operationally in healthcare. So you can use the same process to do a case review, because it's really the same social process. Say, I've got this patient, we're not sure exactly where they are, I want to do a case review across a multidisciplinary team and I don't have time to get them all together. Actually, that's the same process as a CKM review or for us, you know, like a review of a national profile. So I'd like to describe how to do that with FHIR and bed that down and get that working for us and as a pattern that people can adopt for a multidisciplinary, multi-system patient case review. Another thing I hear a lot about that we don't really have nailed is endpoint discovery. Some of you will know that we have some resources to support endpoint recovery, but what I hear a lot about is, okay, but how do we actually build a national endpoint registry? What is it you need to do to govern that? What do you need to do to provision that? What is it you need to do all the mappings, but so all the workflows can find the hooks into the endpoint registry that they need? So that's not anymore a standards process question, that's an implementation question. But it comes up, it's a very big discussion in USA right now, it's a big discussion in Australia right now, and I've heard it from a couple of European countries as well. And I'd like to build some knowledge about that in the FHIR community. All right, so those changes reflect growing maturity of the FHIR specification in the community and a broadening of our focus away from pure standards towards more and more implementation. There's still an amazing amount of work to be done, and in a sense we could sort of start saying, well, you know, we can see the end game here, we can start relaxing and saying, oh, we've done what we've done. But for me personally, that's not the case. I'm going to relax and say I've done what I need to do when my family's healthcare improves because of what we're doing here. If that's my standard, I've got a long way to go. I'm not going to stop anytime soon, right? I do want to acknowledge that we have very strong support for the core development of the specification this year from the US Office of the National Coordinator for Healthcare IT, and we greatly appreciate that support. And I'm done, and got any questions about any of what I've said or anything else about Release 4? I've got 10 minutes for questions. So, yeah, Richard.
So you mentioned right at the start that you're looking for to move patient and observation to be normative.
Yep.
It's not a big set of resources. Are we saying that none of the other resources have met that level of maturity yet for the candidates to go, or is that still being discussed?
So Richard wants to know about whether there's any other candidates and how mature some of the other candidates are. I thought we might get practitioner and related person and organisation in that list, and I don't know where the committee's deliberations are on that right now. So you notice that I said, for instance, patient and stuff around patient and observation and stuff around observation, we're not sure yet. Those patient observation are the most heavily used and the most mature of all the resources in the domain space. The stuff around them, one of the things that we've said is if you're going to fix something and make it so it can't be changed, no breaking changes, you really need to see the resource used across its entire scope. And it's actually a really high bar to climb. So we've got resources that have been hammered and hammered and hammered in half their scope. But there's some other scope that hasn't. And one of them that's going to be a difficult one for us is bundle, right? Everybody's implemented bundle. It's like solid as a rock, except the signature part, which nobody's used. So what do? Do we take that normative? Bundle has to go normative, and so the signature bit's a problem for us. I don't know whether we might carve that out or drop it and bring it back as an extension or something, I don't know, so we can bring it in the future when we actually have it nailed. So those are the considerations around what resources will go normative. And of the ones that we've had and the discussions we've had and analysis we've done, patient and observation are the ones that cross the line, and there's a bunch of candidates sitting on the line and we're trying to figure out which way to fall. So certainly not stable, it has to be stable next month. So if you've got anyone got any feedback you want to make to me or to the committees, make them this week or next week to the committees, because what we've said is if it's not a candidate for normative by the time we open the draft ballot, which is in December, it won't be normative, although we can drop things back from being a candidate to normative.
But just the following question is, so how do you measure the maturity of something then?
I originally want to say how to measure the maturity of it. There's actually a spreadsheet that we maintain that tracks adoption, that tracks the internal quality metrics, that tracks the use of the resource across the scope, and really in the end the decisions are made off that spreadsheet, which is a Google spreadsheet, which is referenced from the FMG page on the wiki. And if you can't find it, come back to me and tell me, and I'll put it in Zulip somewhere or something. But in the end, that's how it works, and so you can go and look at that spreadsheet and see there's about 50, 60 data points that we use to track the use of the resource.
Okay.
I can see you're really convinced there, Richard.
No, I'm saying that's not a process, I'm sure. But how do you know anyone's putting it in? I mean, there's implementation going on around the world. Are you confident that they're getting exactly in that?
We do what we can, and confidence. We do as much as we can. We have tentacles into all of the implementation space to get the feedback that we're looking for, and patient in particular, because that's where every connectathon starts, and so you can actually list the connectathons in the countries, and we can keep making sure, and we do, that we get the feedback from those. Yeah, but in the end, the process is not bulletproof. It's not a mathematically, safe process. It's a social Brownian motion thing. And all we can do is the best we can do. And in a sense, if you keep asking questions like that, the committee start going, oh, maybe we're not sure, maybe, and going, oh, it won't hurt if we can just keep it trial use for a bit longer. So, and that's kind of hard for committees to resist that, actually. Someone says, oh, what about this? Have you looked at this? But, then we'd never get anywhere. So it's, trying to find the right balance there. Any other questions?
Yeah, so regarding the two resources, for instance, you plan to make normative pacing and observation. As I can recall, all the fields have cardinality 0 to 1 or many. At least on pacing and observation. So what is it exactly that you make normative, since nothing basically is required? It's more just the definition of it.
Yeah, that's right. The elements that are defined and the contents of the codes and the data types are the things that go normative, and we can't change those. In terms of minimum cardinalities, it's very unlikely, particularly with those resources, that the minimum cardinality of the resources will change away from 0 for all the elements in them, because they just get used in so many different use cases. And then even, for instance, the US core profile, for those of you who've ever looked, said, oh, well, clearly a patient always has a name. Yeah, well, no, actually not. So it's really even hard for national profiles to shift that. And it really comes down to project level decisions and even particularly use case based decisions. So it's pretty hard to see those minimum cardinality changing on those. And in fact, if you look at the history of any resource, the committee first defines a whole bunch of resources, a whole bunch of elements, and gives them a minimum cardinality of 1, because of course they should always exist. And you can see they just get wound back down to 0 over the course of the lifetime of the resource as people go, but there's a use case. So I hope that answers that question. Yeah.
Yeah, you had the aggregate reporting on the slide in Africa. So I've worked quite a lot with the DHIS2, which is the major system for aggregate reporting and developing.
Yeah, so the project I talked about is a project with some of the authors of DHIS2 and some of the IHE guys working on that, and people from Regan Streif about that. And that's so that I don't think that aggregate reporting is an Africa specific thing, but it certainly comes up really quickly in Africa.
Yeah, so the feedback from them is that they would really like a resource that is for aggregate reporting.
We did start the discussion there. Is Bryn in the room? No. If you go, make sure you get to meet Bryn here. We think there's already a suitable resource for this. You don't need another resource. Bryn is the editor for that resource, and Bryn and Carl and a few others from the IT community are proposing to test out the that resource, the measure resource, the aggregate reporting, and we've been talking about a connectathon and when and where we might do that. But I'd certainly like to see that happen. We talked about doing one in Africa in January, but I don't think we're going to get that one across the line. It's too late now. We'll see. Yeah.
So you specifically mentioned to improve user review process. So is there any plan on that area?
We'd like to introduce a formal review process. If you look on the wiki, the FHIR wiki, there's actually a link on the wiki to a draft implementation guide that I knocked up one afternoon a couple of years ago for how that might work, and we've actually been looking for community interest in making that happen. And it just hasn't crossed the line yet in order to actually give us enough energy to make it happen. But I would certainly like to see that. I'd like to see that happen, and I kind of feel as though that we had the time, we had the resources that we needed. We just needed to prototype it and make people think that it was really a practical thing. I'll put a link on the Zulip implementers channel to that page on the wiki, so that anyone who's interested can look at it and see, go and have a look and see. We just divided up into a number of actors and said these are the different roles you have: a feedback, a form generator, and a feedback tracker, and a communications administrator, and the target of those was, of that profile, is structure definitions for doing what CKM does in value sets. But you could use that against any resource at all. You could nominate a diagnostic report or a procedure request or whatever, and so on, or review this, or a document, and so on, review that. So I'll put that link in the Zulip channel and everyone can have a look at it, and I'm happy to get feedback on that while we're here. Any other questions? Yeah.
When is that hope that FHIR4 is published?
So you can go and look in the wiki and see what the publication schedule for release 4 is. It's slated for release the week before Christmas next year. We can't nail down a release time because the release, actually being able to release, is conditional on meeting our procedural and technical goals. And we have some degree of ability to trade between quality and completeness and consistency in publication. Not in the normative space, not at all. But in the draft space we have more space for that. So we have some ability to manipulate the conditions and meet our conditions in our stated timeline. We have met those before. But we can't commit to meeting those. So it's a planned release date. On the other hand, I'm funded. We have funding from ONC to meet that release date. So we have extremely good motivation to meet that release date, and we're working with the various 20 or so committees that own parts of the spec to say, what is it you need to cross that? And that'll, for those of you in the room who are in the committees, that isn't visible yet, but Wayne and I need to make that visible in the next couple of weeks to actually say we've got some funding to support you to do this, and how that, and we'll talk about how that's going to roll out. We have 3 ballots, opening in December, opening in April, opening in August, and those 3 ballots all need to happen, and then we need the committees to finish their work, and then we publish supposedly at the end of December. But my funding runs out there, so if we don't publish then, I don't know what's going to happen. So we really need to do that. So but it won't happen before. There's no way it will happen before. So it's my Christmas present for next year. I can go, it's done. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, we're at time. This week is a great opportunity for you to give us feedback, give me feedback. Everyone can come and beat up on me, that's how it works. And tell me that some of, we're missing things or we're not doing things that don't matter. Although You know, everybody here has something that we're doing that doesn't matter to them, but it matters to somebody else. It's about, you know, balancing priorities. But please give me lots of feedback. Is that a question? One last question.
You said there was a problem with signature and bundle. Is there a time to discuss that?
Oh man, we don't have any time set. Well, actually, tomorrow I'm talking about security. I'll talk a little bit about digital signatures in my security presentation tomorrow. But really, we have lots and lots of experience with signatures as applied to static documents, frozen documents, CDA documents, basically. We have very little experience around signatures on RESTful interfaces, frozen content running across integration engines. That's really hard problems. And we haven't technically seen anybody come to us and say, here's my implementation tested across multiple systems of signatures in bundle, which is a lesser problem, but just sort of every time we talk about it, runs into the bigger problems. So we haven't seen it yet. I'd love to see some implementations, and I will talk a little bit about this in the security presentation tomorrow, but if there's anybody here who's interested in signatures, come and talk to me, please. All right, thank you very much.